At the beginning of the 64th year, the first serial killer in the history of the Soviet Union was arrested in Moscow. Under the guise of a utility worker, he went around the apartments and dealt with women and children. The maniac Vladimir Ionesyan entered the history of criminology under the nickname Mozgaz. He was shot just 3 weeks after his arrest. The authorities were in such a hurry to exact retribution that they did not even think to study the habits and way of thinking of the serial killer. When, a few years later, maniacs suddenly began to appear in the Soviet Union one after another, it turned out that no one knew how to catch them. Propaganda insisted that there were no maniacs in the country of victorious socialism. The result of the propaganda was terrifying. The Vitebsk maniac case has become the most scandalous in the history of Soviet criminology. These shots were shot shortly after it ended. When a sex maniac appeared in the Vitebsk region, the investigators at the prosecutor's office thought that different people were committing the crimes. For many years, this version remained the only one. In the 70s, the city of Vitebsk was practically not mentioned in the reports of serious criminal crimes. Nothing foreshadowed the bloody horror that was approaching the city. On May 16, 1971, not far from the village of Ekaman, local residents found a girl. A team from the Vitebsk Department of Internal Affairs, led by young detective Boris Loparevich, immediately arrived at the scene. The victim was a very pretty girl. Experts established that the killer squeezed his victim's throat with his hands. The detectives found no documents or valuables at the crime scene. The deceased Ludmila Andorolova, 19 years old, a resident of the village of Ekaman. Detectives assumed that the girl was the victim of a robber. But Boris Loparevich did not understand why the robber had to kill the victim. The search for the perpetrator went on for more than a month, but the killer was never found. They didn't get a result, so Boris Loparevich was recalled investigating other crimes. Another group found the culprit. It turned out to be citizen Glushakov. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The award for solving this crime was given to the investigator for particularly important cases of the prosecutor's office, the legendary Mikasevich. The truth was revealed many years later. Evidence has been collected about the abuse of Javnerovich in the case, which fully confirmed the commission of crimes by Mikhail Javnerovich. But then the newspapers wrote enthusiastically about him. He was admired by the highest levels of government. But too often in court, the accused shouted that the testimony was beaten out of him by force. The detectives paid no attention at all to the next suspicious case in the tragic chain. On October 29, 1971, a citizen of Klopov was attacked on the outskirts of Vitebsk. An unknown person tried to use a clothesline to kill. However, the woman bit through the assailant's arm and raised a scream. At that moment, a group of schoolchildren was passing by and the criminal ran away, throwing the weapon of the failed crime. The girl had good reflexes. She was able to put her hand under the noose and began to pull it with all her might. She was able to scream and call for help. And it was these screams that the schoolchildren passing by heard. The would-be victim bit the strangler's hand. The criminal escaped, leaving behind an important piece of evidence, a rope with traces of his blood, as it later turned out, of the first type. A clothesline is a useful household item that is gradually becoming a thing of the past. Almost every city apartment has washing machines and dryers. In those years, clotheslines were part of the urban landscape, and it was from this rope that the unknown criminal made a weapon. The handwriting of this crime was similar to the recent crime. It would seem that it is necessary to draw a conclusion, but no one was going to do it. The garrote found was handled simply. She wasn't on the evidence list. And then they threw it away. There was no murder. The investigators did not want to study the old cases, and few people were interested in the fact that an innocent man received a maximum sentence of 15 years. Meanwhile, the crimes continued. In the USSR, the very concept of a maniac was generally strictly prohibited at that time. The maniac from Vitebsk acted cautiously and inventively. He strangled women in various ways. He also tried to hide the bodies of the victims away so that they would not be found for as long as possible. In the 70s, there were only a few dozen houses on the outskirts of this village. All the residents knew each other. And so 20-year-old Luda Korochenko mysteriously disappeared just 200 meters from her house. Luda was found only a few weeks later in a pit and identified by the ring on her finger. Later it turns out that the girl begged to be released. She wasn't pleading for herself, but for her younger sister, who needed to be rushed to the hospital for surgery. But her pleas didn't work. Belarus was one of the most successful and peaceful republics. No one in Belarus has ever heard of maniacs. It was believed that this phenomenon was a consequence of the licentious mores of the cruel world of money. And in the Soviet Union, nothing like this could have arisen. Detectives and ordinary police officers did their job in good faith, searched for evidence, and interrogated witnesses. And then the big politics began. Another murder committed by the Vitebsk monster. It cost 3 young people their freedom at once. One witness saw 3 guys with a shepherd dog not far from the crime scene. Soon, 3 friends, Kovalev, Yanchenko, and Pashkevich, were detained in the suburbs of Vitebsk. Investigator Zavnorovich put forward the theory that the murder was committed by young people with a shepherd dog. In one of the volumes of the criminal case, which was considered by the court, there was a photograph of a small puppy. It was the only clue. Everything else was based on recognition. The 3 friends were confused in their testimony. These are the rarest shots. A confrontation between friends. It is conducted by the same Mikhail Zavnerovich. The contradictions in the testimony and the lack of evidence did not bother anyone. According to the court verdict, Kovalev served 15 years in prison, Pashkevich 12 years, Yanchenko 2 years. Between 1971 and 1984, 22 women were strangled in the Vitebsk region. 14 people were convicted of these crimes. One of the convicts was shot by a court verdict, and another convicted person became completely blind in prison. That day, Olga was waiting for her fiancé Mikhail. Olga arrived on time, but the groom was late. When he arrived, the girl was dead. The delay cost Olga her life, and he, Mikhail, his freedom. Mikhail was blamed for her death. Murder motivated by jealousy was written in the verdict of the court. The term is 10 years in a high-security penal colony. What did this man feel? How did you endure this monstrous injustice? Mikhail will be released only after the real culprit is found. After many years, another 12 people are also being rehabilitated, and another one sentenced to death, but posthumously. The case of stranglers has been tried 11 times in court. There were always convictions that were really worthless. Moreover, the lawyers not only did not prove the charges were invalid, but often persuaded them to take the blame for the crime on themselves. The courts in the USSR have always been characterized by an accusatory bias. There was usually no competition between the prosecutor and the lawyer. And only representatives of the prosecutor's office became judges. It was impossible to get from lawyers to judges. What was the cause of these fatal errors? What allowed the criminal to walk free for many years? At that time, the whole country was gripped by socialist competitions. Cities, regions, and republics compete in everything: labor productivity and productivity, milk yield and mining. A special place is occupied by indicators that confirm that life is getting better every year. Party leaders built their careers on these figures. Careerism in the army and in the Communist Party was a normal phenomenon. Today, you are the secretary of the district branch of the party. Tomorrow, you are the second secretary of the city branch of the party. Therefore, to admit that a homicidal maniac had been operating in Vitebsk for many years meant to undo all the glorious achievements of this area and provoke the wrath of the party leadership of the Republic. And then, maybe, the country's. The apartment of one of the suspects was searched many times. The first 7 searches yielded nothing, and the suspect himself continued to say that he had never met this woman. And so, during the 8th search, the detectives triumphantly extracted a photograph of the murdered girl from behind the sofa. The photo was old and yellowed. How could she get here? The suspect was beaten by the police, after which he wrote a voluntary confession and received a sentence of 15 years in prison. In 1979, another murder was committed. 30-year-old Nikolai Terenya was accused of it. He was sentenced to death. Nikolai's friend Lyudmila Kadushkina was sentenced to 10 years in prison as an accomplice. The evidence was solely the confessions of the detainees, which were extracted using the standard method. They were required to accuse each other of murder in the expectation of a shorter term. Lyudmila and Nikolai were threatened with execution if they did not confess to the crime. Oleg Adamov became another victim of the investigation. They detained him at the exit of the pub and put him in jail for 15 days under the pretext that he was swearing obscenities. During these 15 days, he was interrogated every day, forcing him to confess to the murder. He denied everything. Then the investigators forged the results of the biological examination along with the seal and showed them to Adamov. Under such pressure, he wrote a confession. They helped him with the correct testimony. They threatened to bring me in for 2 more murdered women. They beat me, shouted that they would shoot me, as if trying to escape. Adamov recalled, "I refused to turn myself in earlier and stated that I had not killed anyone." I got down on my knees, cried, and asked them not to send me to a mental hospital. I confessed to the murder again. I was brought to such a state that I was tired of living. I could see no end to this torment. Oleg Adamov was sentenced to 15 years in prison. 40 years ago, as well as now, women were the main labor force in garment factories. Every evening, at the end of the second shift, they went home. And the third shift workers were walking towards them along the same poorly lit streets. The frightened women began to refuse to work the second and third shifts. Rumors about the Vitebsk maniac spread throughout the country. But honest investigators expressed doubts about the correctness of the verdicts. Nikolai Ignatovich, a young investigator in particularly important cases, was the first to talk about the serial killer. He has concentrated all the cases of the murder of women. Over several months of painstaking work, Ignatovich checked about 30 criminal cases, which allowed him to draw up an approximate portrait of the Vitebsk strangler. According to him, the maniac was distinguished by his attractive appearance, thanks to which he lured his victims, brown and curly hair. And the murderer was born from the Vitebsk region because he is well versed in the terrain. In addition, investigator Nikolai Ignatovich suggested that the maniac's work was somehow connected with cars. Since 1981, the maniac decided to change the style of crimes. Now he did not attack the victims on the street, but offered to give the girls a ride to the right place, and when they agreed, he dealt with them. Buses rarely ran, and the girls, tired after work, agreed to hitch a ride. The number of victims of the Vitebsk strangler grew rapidly, and the intervals between the atrocities decreased. If, in 1971, the criminal killed 2 girls, then in 1984, already 12. Obviously, such a large number of murders could not remain without the attention of the authorities. The authorities in Moscow are interested in the summary of serious crimes in the Vitebsk region. The statistics looked too suspicious. The Ministry of Internal Affairs decided to conduct an operation to catch the criminal with live bait. The capture team was ready to neutralize the criminal at any moment. The status of a vigilante helped the maniac to find out that, under the guise of ordinary girls, criminal investigation officers with secret microphones took to the roads of the region. The plan to capture the criminal for bait failed. Investigator Ignatovich guessed that this criminal was most likely a freelance police officer, and it was precisely because of this that he repeatedly evaded the investigation. The investigator also claimed that this criminal was most likely masquerading as an exemplary family man and did not arouse suspicion from colleagues and friends. And his extraordinary cruelty is most likely offset by his tenderness, sweetness, and cloying love for others. The party leaders, concerned about a possible scandal, ordered the dismissal of investigator Nikolai Ignatovich from his job. Meanwhile, the hunt for the bait was underway. But it ended in complete failure, and the crimes continued, and the pauses between them became shorter and shorter. In 1984, the real nightmare began. In February, 2 women, Sorokina and Kuleshova, disappeared. In June 1984, the headquarters for the detection of the maniac was established. During the year, 12 women died at the hands of the Vitebsk strangler. In 1985, the Vitebsk authorities sent an experienced detective, Police Colonel Vyacheslav Grib. By this time, panic reigned among the population in the Vitebsk region. There were so many crimes that investigator Grib suggested that a whole gang might be operating. Moreover, the bandits are well trained and operate at a professional level, and they probably have a car. Only one thing remained unclear: why? Why were these seemingly senseless murders committed? There could only be one answer. There is a maniac operating in the Vitebsk region. Vyacheslav Ivanovich Grib drew attention to the documents drawn up by investigator Ignatovich, who was the first to express the version about the maniac. The new head also appealed to the residents of the Vitebsk region with a request for help. It was not accepted in the USSR. Vyacheslav Grib convinced his superiors that human life is worth more than the professional pride of the planet. The announcements on radio and television were followed by a flurry of calls to the police. The maniac probably got scared and made a mistake. He wrote a letter to the city newspaper. In the letter, the mysterious organization Patriots of Vitebsk claimed responsibility for all the crimes. While at the same time, the Patriots of Vitebsk fought against the hated Soviet regime. But this letter got into the KGB, and there it was classified. This letter will be sent to the police later after the death of the next victim of the killer. And the maniac, pleased with himself, went on the last hunt in his life. He strangled the 36th victim and put a note in his victim's mouth with a short message: for treason, death. Fighting cops and communists. Only after this incident did the security officers inform the Interior Ministry staff about what was happening. And experts who have studied 2 messages from the Patriots of Vitebsk have established that they were written by the same person. Thanks to saliva samples left on the envelope, detectives learned that the suspect had the first blood type. Detectives found out shortly before her death that the girl got into a red Zaporozhets. Therefore, a purely technical job was required: to check all the owners of the red Zaporozhets and find the killer among them by handwriting. It would seem that it would be easier, but that year there were almost 7,000 owners of such cars in the Vitebsk region. Experts compared the handwriting of all the owners of such cars with letters from the maniac. And one day, all the letters matched. The perpetrator turned out to be Gennady Mikasevich, 38 years old, a foreman at the Dwina farm. He was the secretary of the local Communist Party organization, married, with 2 children. His portrait was on the plaque, and he was respected by his neighbors and colleagues. 3 task forces immediately went to him, but he was not at home. Gennady Mikasevich was the commander of a squad of volunteer police assistants. Therefore, he participated in the search for the maniac and checked the red Zaporozhets. It was impossible to believe in his guilt. Mikasevich was calm during the arrest, so the detectives even began to doubt again. Could it be that they were mistaken? When the handcuffs snapped on his wrists, he told his shocked wife that he would be back soon. But when the maniac was taken out into the yard, his own body gave him away. While he was walking to the car, he asked to go to the toilet many times. Nevertheless, Mikasevich did not lose hope that he would be able to get out of this. He presented his version of events. He claimed that one day his Zaporozhets was stopped by two unknown people. They put him in their car, took him to a deserted place, and there, under threat of death, forced him to write a letter on behalf of the patriots of Vitebsk. During the entire investigation, Mikasevich was in the cell. There was always a man from the State Security Committee by his side. He was protecting his ward, and not from suicide at all, but from sudden death. Too many high-ranking police officers and prosecutors dreamed that the Vitebsk monster would be silenced forever. After all, the trial of Mikasevich threatened them with great troubles. Gennady Mikasevich was born in the Vitebsk region. My father was an alcoholic, and during binge drinking, he became an extremely aggressive person. There were scandals and fights in the house, and the neighborhood guys teased Mikasevich, calling him the son of an alcoholic. Therefore, Mikasevich grew up an unsociable and withdrawn child. In his youth, he nevertheless began an affair with a fellow villager, Elena. But while Mikasevich was in the army, Elena married another man. It was a real shock for Mikasevich. It all started on May 14, 1971. He decided to take his own life. After getting a clothesline, he went towards the village of Ikimon to hang himself there. But his plans suddenly changed when he saw 19-year-old Lyudmila Andorolova, who attracted him with a beautiful tan. Mikasevich attacked the unfortunate woman from behind, raped her, and then strangled her with his bare hands. After that, he tied the dead woman's hands with a clothesline and dragged her body away. Later, coolly and with a wide smile, he would tell the investigators that there was no sadness after the murder. Gennady Mikasevich got special pleasure when the victim resisted, scratched, and struggled. Surprisingly, Gennady Mikasevich got married and had 2 children. His daughter was named Elena, and he adored her. He bought toys, spoiled her with gifts, and spent all his free time with her. My relationship with my wife was also going well, but one day there was an incident that really scared her. In the dream, Mikasevich grabbed her by the throat and began to strangle her. The wife screamed. The maniac woke up and pulled himself together. Judging that her husband was just overworking, she quickly calmed down. In the pre-trial detention center in Vitebsk, Mikasevich felt like a star. He would not begin any interrogation until the video camera was turned on. He made casual black jokes, saying that he does not consider women human, since women often offended him. I strangled them, and by doing so removed the burden from my soul, the killer explained. Everyone who knew Mikasevich personally was in a state of shock. No one could have imagined that this exemplary family man and father of 2 children was a bloodthirsty and ruthless maniac. Mikasevich decided that he could escape responsibility by pretending to be mentally ill, but psychiatrists determined that he was sane. At the same time, according to experts, the maniac committed crimes due to sexual deviations. The accused himself anticipated the glory of the future trial and was happy that he was being filmed during the investigative activities. The Vitebsk strangler was sentenced to capital punishment and received a bullet from the executioner in the fall of the same 1987. More than 200 law enforcement officers who broke the law were punished, mostly with reprimands, and several people were suspended from work. So this case was not a glaring exception in the Soviet justice system. Was there remorse among the investigators who imprisoned innocent people? Hardly. And, unfortunately, to this day the law enforcement system can fall with all its might not on the criminal, but on the one who is easier to declare guilty. In order to be convinced of this, it is enough to compare the percentage of acquittals in a regular court and a jury trial, 0.1 and almost 25. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel to hear new stories.